The night Hermione breaks time. What if the time turner didn't execute a perfect loop? What if, in the most carefully orchestrated night of Harry Potter's third year, Hermione Granger's hand simply slipped? Tonight, we deconstruct a timeline where the hospital wing window is not the start of a neat circle, but the moment reality fractures. The scene is familiar, moonlit stone, the muffled chaos of werewolf howls fading across the grounds. Harry in the hospital bed, pale and furious. Hermione at the window, fingers tight around a delicate hourglass that the Ministry insists is a harmless academic convenience. In canon, the chain settles around their necks, 3 precise turns pull them backwards, and the universe politely pretends it was always meant to happen. But the core issue is mechanical. Her thumb catches. The chain snags on the bed frame. In the half-second of panic, Hermione overcorrects and wrenches the hourglass 1 turn too far. 4 rotations, not 3. The time turner shudders, the air compresses, and for the first time that year, Hermione does not control the schedule. She fires a ministry-regulated weapon in the middle of Hogwarts, and she does it by accident. On paper, time turners are about punctuality, extra arithmancy, double history of magic, the tidy illusion that time can be bent without consequence as long as your homework gets done. But the subtext is brutal. These devices live in the Department of Mysteries, beside locked doors and shattered experimental prototypes, because the people who study time understand that every extra rotation is a loaded spell aimed at the structure of the world. Outside the hospital wing, the divergence is finalized. The grounds lurch past faster than they should. Shadows smear. When the spinning stops, Hermione is not just standing beside Harry behind the pumpkin patch. She is also still in the castle, in the hospital wing, existing as the original version of herself who has not yet touched the chain. 2 Hermiones. One timeline that was never designed to hold them both. In the story we know, this night is a clean loop. Buckbeak is rescued, Sirius is freed, and the past quietly rearranges itself to preserve the boy who lives path toward Book 4. Here, the turning point arrives in the smallest miscalculation. If the loop fails, who actually dies on these grounds? Does Buckbeak fall to the executioner's axe, dragging Hagrid into ministry disgrace? Does Sirius remain in his tower cell long enough for Fudge and Snape to secure a Dementor's kiss? Does Harry ever reach the Triwizard Tournament at all? Back in the hospital wing, the cost becomes visible. Under the same moon, the first Hermione, the one who never miscounted, gasps for breath in the shadows, feeling the air thicken around her as time resists duplication. Down below, the second Hermione turns in confusion, sensing a pressure she cannot name. From this moment on, canon is broken. The castle now holds 2 versions of the same witch, and the timeline has to decide which one it is willing to keep. Rules of time, what Hermione was never meant to do. The castle does not answer immediately, but the rules do. What, exactly, has Hermione violated? What did the Ministry design time turners to prevent? And why does this tiny chain of sand threaten the entire narrative architecture of Harry's world? To understand the fracture she has created, we deconstruct a timeline the Ministry has spent decades trying to hold in place. Officially, time turners are not instruments of heroism or revisionist fantasy. They are bureaucratic tools. The Ministry licenses a handful of them for academic scheduling, letting overachievers attend arithmancy at 9 and ancient runes at 9:30, and for tightly monitored experiments in the Department of Mystery's time room. Every legal use is logged, every rotation is recorded. The structure is intentionally dull because dullness is safe. The time room itself is a warning disguised as a laboratory, shelves of hourglasses, clocks that melt and reform, a bell jar where a hummingbird dies and is reborn in an endless loop. The core issue is mechanical. Time magic in this universe is not a whimsical backdrop. It is a volatile system that punishes improvisation. Unspeakables do not study time to rewrite reality. They study it to keep reality from tearing. Dumbledore's instructions in Prisoner of Azkaban are the Ministry's terror translated into gentle prose. You may influence the past, but you must not be seen. You may throw a stone, free a hippogriff, conjure a Patronus, but you must not attempt to radically change what has already happened. The implication is chilling. The timeline is not generously flexible. It is brittle, self-defensive, almost sentient in its resistance to contradiction. Hermione's hour-by-hour model is built to respect that brittleness. It permits only small temporal displacements, a few hours at most, keeping the user close to their own lived sequence so causality can quietly fold back over itself. No alternate universes, no grand resets. Contrast that with the advanced, unstable prototypes in Cursed Child, which hurl users years into the past and generate visibly divergent presents where Voldemort wins, Cedric becomes a Death Eater, and the divergence is finalized in grotesque new histories. Those devices do not bend time, they shear it. The unspoken nightmare behind both designs is paradox. Overlapping selves occupying the same corridor, conflicting actions, one Hermione saving Buckbeak, another accidentally revealing Sirius. A cascade of mutually exclusive outcomes that forces time into an impossible equation. When that happens, Ministry doctrine does not imagine a neat correction. It imagines a time fracture so severe that unspeakables must intervene, quarantine the affected reality, and decide which version of events is allowed to continue. The subtext is brutal. Time travel is not merely dangerous. It is governed by a quiet authoritarianism of physics and policy working together. This is where Hermione becomes thematically exposed. Her identity is precision, control, obedience to rules that promise safety. She color codes revision schedules. She trusts systems. But the Time Turner is the one arena where her rule following cannot guarantee stability because the universe itself is enforcing a higher statute. When she miscounts, she does not just break school policy. She collides with the only rule the cosmos refuses to correct for her. That is the psychological horror of this alternate Hermione, the moment she realizes that loyalty to instructions cannot save everyone, and that her own excellence has manufactured a catastrophe the Ministry never prepared her to survive. The misturn, when two Hermiones occupy one moment. The turning point arrives, not with a scream, but with a number, 3 turns back. That is the instruction, the ritual, the illusion of safety that has carried Hermione through a year of sanctioned temporal cheating. But tonight, under the weight of Buckbeak's fate and Sirius's impending execution, her hand slips on the chain. The core issue is mechanical. Her fingers over-rotate, metal bites her skin, and the Time Turner jerks one half turn further than intended before she yanks it still. She feels it immediately. The world does not simply rewind, it lurches. Shadows smear, the grounds of Hogwarts smear and snap, and the air carries a faint echo of her own footsteps that should not yet exist. Instead of landing cleanly 3 hours back, she arrives 3 hours and several minutes earlier in a corridor already occupied by her previous self. Concrete action, then catastrophe. She sprints out of the empty classroom, Harry on her heels, calculating in rapid-fire whispers which staircases will be moving, which portraits will be asleep. She rounds a corner at the exact second her earlier self, burdened with books and a schedule no human should endure, does the same. Two Hermiones collide chest first, the impact knocking both onto the flagstones. A bag splits open, parchment and arithmancy notes exploding across the floor in a paper halo. Two identical voices say, "Sorry," at once, then they both freeze. This is not polyjuice, not a metamorph magus, not an illusion. Each Hermione is staring into a face that matches not only features, but the micro-expressions she has memorized in mirrors, the tightness at the jaw, the way the left eyebrow lifts a fraction first. Reality does not bend here, it fractures. We deconstruct a timeline in a single shared inhalation, as both girls understand, with a precision only Hermione could weaponize against herself, that this is the one thing Dumbledore told them must never happen. The butterfly effect is instantaneous and petty. One dropped ink bottle rolls, clinks sharply against stone, and that sound carries. Down the corridor, Snape pauses mid-stride, irritation sharpening into suspicion, a full minute earlier than in canon. Outside, near Hagrid's hut, a flicker of movement, two small shapes doubling back in panic, catches the edge of Cornelius Fudge's vision. He frowns. The execution party slows, and Buckbeak's handlers hesitate for a moment that did not exist in the original structure of events. Inside the corridor, the subtext is brutal. One Hermione scrambles to gather her books, babbling about schedules and exams as a defensive spell against the terror clawing up her throat. The other, the misturned Hermione, grabs her own wrist with white-knuckled urgency and hisses that they must not be seen, that this is how paradoxes are born, that the Ministry has entire departments dedicated to preventing exactly this. Too late. Harry arrives a beat behind, skidding to a halt, eyes ricocheting between two identical best friends. His psychological map of the world, already warped by Dementors and betrayal, takes another hit. Which Hermione is his? Which one knows about Buckbeak, about Sirius, about the future they are trying to repair without admitting it is broken? Outside, that tiny delay at the hut compounds. Hagrid's sobs go on a fraction longer. Fudge's entourage mutters. A guard checks the sky. The divergence is finalized not in a grand explosion of magic, but in bureaucratic hesitation and human confusion. And at the end of the corridor, Snape turns the corner. His robes billow, his eyes narrow, and for a suspended second he sees them. Two bushy-haired silhouettes, overlapping yet distinct, where there should only ever be one. He does not speak. He simply registers the impossibility and steps forward. Dumbledore, Fudge, and the first temporal cover-up Snape does the one thing no one expects in that corridor of almost overlapping Hermione's. He notices. By the time they reach the Shrieking Shack, the dynamic is already poisoned. In canon, Snape storms in with a decade of resentment and a convenient invisibility cloak reveal. Here, he brings something far more dangerous than a grudge. He brings a theory. Why were there two shadows on the stairwell? Why did the air around Granger ripple, as if the magic in the room were flinching away from her? He files it away, weaponized curiosity hidden behind the usual contempt. When the confrontation explodes, Sirius accused, Lupin exposed, Harry screaming that Peter is alive. Snape's fury is real, but it is no longer simple. Every time Hermione speaks, his eyes flick, measuring timing, cadence, the microscopic delays of someone who has already heard these words once. The subtext is brutal. He is not just deciding whether to believe Black. He is deciding whether to believe reality. What happens when a man who hates being made a fool suspects that time itself has been altered without his consent? The turning point arrives in the hospital wing. Fudge is already rattled, his claim to normalcy structurally annihilated by a Dementor attack on students and the humiliation of an escaped mass murderer, Animagus. He wants a clean narrative. Mad Dog Sirius, brave ministry, unfortunate trauma. Then Snape leans in, voice low, and mentions an anomaly. Duplicate students, impossible sightings, a shimmer around Miss Granger that feels wrong. Cornelius Fudge is not an academic, but he is a bureaucrat with a survival instinct. He has read, in the driest possible memoranda, what happens when time turners misfire. The core issue is mechanical. Once you admit that the sequence of events is in doubt, every decision you make can be retroactively invalidated. Power becomes fragile. Authority becomes a provisional illusion. So he does what ministry protocol demands. Quietly, we deconstruct a timeline, and we find paperwork. An unspeakable is owled under a meaningless code phrase. A temporal incident file is opened, somewhere deep in the time room, its cover stamped with a classification that outranks justice for Sirius Black. Containment becomes the priority, not truth, not fairness, stability, and Dumbledore feels it before the owl even leaves. He stands at the end of Harry's bed, watching Hermione with that unsettling stillness he uses when reality has offered him a choice between evils. There is a faint shimmer around her, a temporal residue he has seen only once before, when a prototype time-turner cracked in the Department of Mysteries and froze a man's scream halfway out of his throat. The timeline feels misaligned, as if events are resting on the wrong vertebrae. In canon, this is where he gently instructs her to turn back time and fix everything. Here, the divergence is finalized in a single, shocking motion. He takes the chain from her neck. No explanation, no kindly twinkle. His fingers close around the time turner with the decisiveness of someone seizing a weapon, not lending a tool. Hermione starts to protest. "But Professor, we can still..." "No," he says, and the word lands with more weight than any spell. "You already have." Pattern interrupt. For her. For us. For the ministry now racing to reframe this as a controlled anomaly rather than a cascading fracture. Because once an unspeakable walks through the doors of Hogwarts, this stops being a school year adventure and becomes an active investigation into whether the world the characters remember is the one that actually happened. And the next question is viciously simple: whose memories will be allowed to stand? Buckbeak dies, Sirius stays, and time refuses to heal. So whose memories win when time itself is evidence? Whose version of events survives when the ministry stops treating this as school mischief and starts treating it as a crime scene? In this moment, we deconstruct a timeline where the answer is not Harry's. The turning point arrives on the hillside above Hagrid's hut. In canon, the rescue of Buckbeak is a tight but functional choreography: rock, distraction, chain, flight. Here, the core issue is mechanical. Hermione has miscounted. There are too many Hermiones in too small a radius, the angles are wrong, and she hesitates when she sees her own sleeve vanish around the pumpkin patch a beat too early. That half-second of double self-confusion is all it takes. Snape, already on high alert from unspeakable briefings about possible temporal anomalies, is watching the window, not the executioner. Fudge has been warned that any deviation from schedule may indicate tampering. So when a shadow moves where it did not move before, when a chain clinks out of sequence, their wands are in their hands before Hermione has even reached the first knot. Buckbeak screams. The axe actually falls this time. It is not a symbolic thud into a stump. It is a clean, sanctioned killing of a creature Harry has just stroked, just flown. The sound travels up through the ground and into Hagrid's bones. For him, this is not only the loss of a friend, it is the Ministry proving, in one swing, that his loyalty is disposable. Hagrid's grief becomes structural. He still pours tea in that hut, but the dynamic has shifted. The man who once defended Dumbledore's judgment to anyone who would listen now watches the headmaster with a new, quiet suspicion. When the Ministry later demands his cooperation, when Dolores Umbridge inspects his lessons, that old compliance is gone. The subtext is brutal. The state killed his hippogriff on a technicality, and no amount of lemon drops will repair that trauma. Down at the lake, the fracture widens. Without Buckbeak waiting as an escape vector, Sirius reaches the shore with nowhere to go. The Dementors close in on a timeline that never freed him. Harry still raises his wand, still believes his father is about to appear, but this is a reality where the Patronus lesson was never meant to save two lives at once. There is no aerial exit, no desperate leap onto feathered wings. At best, Sirius is recaptured. At worst, a kiss delivered under Fudge's watchful eye, quietly justified as containment of a temporal threat. For Harry, the psychological fallout is catastrophic. In the original structure, he walks away with a fugitive godfather and a thin thread of hope. Here, he walks away with documented proof that every adult in power, Dumbledore, Fudge, Snape, knew time was breaking and still let Sirius be taken. His distrust of institutions, already present, becomes weaponized. Fifth-year Harry in this timeline does not merely resent the Ministry, he studies its weaknesses, and this is where the divergence is finalized. If Sirius never escapes, there is no protective godfather in the shadows, no messy, flawed adult absorbing some of Voldemort's psychological pressure, who stands between Harry and the Dark Lord's manipulations in Order of the Phoenix, when the only man who loved him as family is either dead or kissed. More dangerously, when the prophecy in the Department of Mysteries comes due, what happens to a world where the man who was meant to die in Harry's place is already gone? Hermione, under investigation. The unspeakables arrive. So what does the Ministry do when the man who was meant to die in Harry's place is already gone, and the cause is not Voldemort, but a third year with a necklace? Who polices a mistake that rewrites prophecy? In this darker timeline, the answer arrives in silence. They come at dawn, hooded, faceless, their robes a shade too black for Hogwarts' usual theatrics. Officially, the Unspeakables are there for a security review after the Dementor incident and the Azkaban escape. Unofficially, every wand they carry is calibrated to one thing: time. The core issue is mechanical. Their instruments are tuned to detect deviations in temporal pressure, microcurrents of magic where reality has been bent against its grain. Hogwarts changes overnight. Corridors are quietly sealed. Staircases are frozen in a single configuration. The Quidditch pitch is declared off-limits under the pretext of weather wards, but in truth, it sits on a line of temporal drag from the forest to the lake. The castle is not fully locked down, but it is partially quarantined, treated as a potential fracture site on the broader timeline. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated. At the center of this invisible cordon stands Hermione Granger. The tests begin in the hospital wing, because even temporal enforcement must pretend to care about bed rest. An Unspeakable presses the tip of his wand to the inside of her wrist, not to check her pulse, but to listen to it. Each beat is compared against a silent metronome only he can hear, measuring how many hours she has truly lived. An hourglass-shaped device hovers above her chest, sand falling upwards, then sideways, then pausing in mid-air when it hits the moments where she doubled back on herself. They ask questions that seem benign. What time did you leave Hagrid's hut? Who was in the corridor outside the fat lady's portrait? Did you hear the clock in the tower strike before or after you saw Buckbeak? Each answer is cross-referenced against enchanted quills in the time room miles away, quills that have already recorded a different version of that night. The subtext is brutal. They are not just probing her memory, they are testing which reality deserves to be canon. Dumbledore watches, hands steepled, gaze unreadable. He understands the bureaucratic psychology as well as the magic. If the Department of Mysteries concludes that Hermione has not simply used a time turner, but destabilized the structure of cause and effect, this financial technicality forces their hand. She becomes an asset or a threat, not a student. Removal from Hogwarts is one option. Removal from the normal flow of time is another. For Hermione, this is not abstract. The girl who once weaponized timetables now realizes she has broken the one rule written beneath all the others. Do not move the hinges of history. Buckbeak's survival, Sirius's fate, Harry's grief over a godfather who never even had the chance to run. Every altered outcome resolves, in her mind, into a single accusation. She did this. The trauma is not only guilt, it is ontological. She no longer trusts the continuity of her own day, and then the turning point arrives. An unspeakable requests a private word with Dumbledore in his office. No theatrics, no threats. Just a single clinical report from the time room. Their instruments show a hairline fracture in the timeline, centered precisely on Hermione Granger's temporal signature. Fractures, he explains, do not heal on their own. Left untreated, they widen into full temporal splits. Dumbledore asks the only question that matters. What happens, he says quietly, when the divergence is finalized? The Unspeakable's answer is simple. We do not yet know which version of reality will survive. Year 4. Rewritten, a darker Triwizard without Sirius. Year 4 opens with an absence. No Hogsmeade permission slip, signed in jagged black ink. No promise that a wanted man will be watching. When Vernon reads the third-year letters about Harry's convict godfather, he no longer has a reason to be afraid. In this timeline, there was no successful escape, no owl-born threat. The core issue is mechanical. Remove Sirius as a looming consequence, and the Dursley household reverts to its original power structure, only harsher. Harry returns from a year of time fractures and institutional betrayal to a house that has learned nothing. The bars do not go back on the windows, but the control tightens in smaller, more insidious ways. Locked cupboards, withheld meals, a ban on freakish late-night studying. Petunia's anxiety, already sharpened by the unexplained ministry interest in Hermione's time turner, translates into hyper-vigilant policing of Harry's every move. The subtext is brutal. Without even the illusion of a godfather, he is not a nephew under sufferance. He is an unwanted asset they cannot yet discard. So when the Weasleys rip the boarded fireplace out of the wall and drag Harry to the Quidditch World Cup, he arrives not buoyed by secret correspondence with Sirius, but hollowed out by a summer of unmitigated isolation. This alters his reading of the campsite, the Ministry's strained jokes, the forced joviality around foreign wizards, the way Bagman waves off every concern about security. Harry files it all under a single conclusion. These people will not save him. When the masked Death Eaters march and the dark mark burns over the trees, Canon Harry is horrified and confused. This Harry is horrified and confirmed. Buckbeak's execution, that wasn't, Sirius's recapture, and the Unspeakable's clinical language about acceptable temporal loss have already taught him that the system will sacrifice individuals to preserve its own narrative. The attack at the World Cup is not an aberration, it is data. Each green flare is further evidence that magic, in this reality, serves power first and children last. Meanwhile, Hermione enters fourth year under a different kind of spotlight. The Department of Mysteries has quietly flagged her file. The girl who cracked time is now a living risk assessment. She keeps her prefect-level composure, but her schedule is altered without explanation. No more time turner, no advanced arithmancy practicum on temporal theory, an unsmiling witch from the Ministry sitting in on certain classes. Officially, she is being rewarded for her brilliance. In practice, her autonomy over time magic has been revoked. Pattern interrupt. Hermione accepts this, at least on the surface. Internally, the guilt metastasizes into obsession. If one miscalculation helped doom Sirius, then the only ethical response, in her mind, is to perfect the calculations. While other students gossip about the Triwizard Tournament, she raids the library's banned sections for references to experimental time turners, cross-referencing half-burned notes on the time room with Muggle physics. She is not chasing extra homework hours anymore. She is trying to design a retroactive apology. This psychological fracture reshapes the tournament year. At the Yule Ball, Harry's awkwardness is no longer cushioned by Sirius's sardonic advice. There is no "treat her like a human being, and you'll be fine" echoing in his head, only the chronic sense that adults who claim loyalty will eventually choose policy over people. He dances because he must, but he scans the staff table between songs, tracking Dumbledore, Moody, and every ministry official with the wary attention of prey that has learned the hunters wear badges. The second task becomes another referendum on institutional trust. In canon, Harry's decision to rescue all the hostages emerges from his instinctive heroism. Here, the calculation is darker. He has watched a hippogriff and a godfather become acceptable losses. He has listened to Unspeakable's debate which reality is more stable. When he surfaces with Gabriel, as well as Ron, it is not just because he cannot bear to leave her. It is because he is testing a hypothesis. If he refuses the tournament's premise and saves everyone, will the structure punish him for exceeding the script? By the time the maze closes around him, Barty Crouch Jr.'s manipulation does not need to overcome a boy anchored by godfatherly reassurance. It needs only to redirect an already weaponized distrust. Constant vigilance lands differently on a child who has watched the Ministry surveil his best friend for using magic correctly at the wrong time. Harry enters the hedges not merely nervous, but convinced that every adult has a hidden agenda and that if he wants to survive, he must outthink them all. Then the turning point arrives. The Portkey, the graveyard, the rebirth of Voldemort, these beats remain structurally similar, but the internal dynamic is altered. When Voldemort taunts him with the Ministry's denial, with Azkaban, with institutional cowardice, the words do not bounce off naive faith, they land on lived experience. Harry has already watched Fudge refuse to see a hippogriff's innocence, already watched the Ministry treat Hermione's temporal trauma as a paperwork anomaly, so when he returns, bloody and shaking, clutching Cedric's body, the canonical script expects him to shout the truth in front of everyone. Here, he hesitates. What if Fudge calls the Unspeakables, declares this another unstable branch to be managed rather than believed? What if, by speaking publicly, he hands the Ministry the narrative power to bury Voldemort's return under jargon and denial? In this altered timeline, the first person he tells is Dumbledore alone, in secret, in a locked office that still smells of lemon drops and phoenix ash. The divergence is finalized not in the graveyard, but in that whispered choice, to treat the Ministry not as flawed protectors, but as an active threat to the truth. And that single decision will dictate how Year 5 burns. Temporal fallout, the time room and the shattered hourglasses. Year 5 burns in the Department of Mysteries. On the surface, the time room sequence in Order of the Phoenix reads as chaos. Shelves toppling, hourglasses shattering, time sand spilling in glittering arcs as curses fly. But what if that apparent collateral damage is not an accident at all? What if, by the time Harry crashes through that door, the Unspeakables have already decided that the time room is a controlled demolition site? The core issue is mechanical. Hermione's third-year accident in this timeline does not stay an amusing footnote in McGonagall's files. It becomes the foundational case study in every internal Ministry seminar on temporal risk, an over-rotation, a double Hermione collision, a few minutes of overlapping consciousness that leave measurable scars in the ambient magic around Hogwarts. The Unspeakables catalog the anomaly, trace the temporal turbulence, and realize with clinical horror that a schoolgirl with a timetable has almost torn reality. From that point, the time room changes. It stops being a neutral archive of controlled devices and becomes a living scar. Hourglasses that once ticked with metronomic precision now stutter. Some grains fall upward, some hang mid-air, some reverse for a heartbeat before surrendering to gravity again. Experimental time loops glitch. A teacup falls, shatters, repairs itself, then remains half-cracked, as if the timeline cannot quite remember which outcome it chose. In the center, suspended in blue light, a record orb replays the night at Hogwarts when Hermione duplicated herself, the image flickering as if the memory resists being pinned down. The subtext is brutal. With Voldemort rising, with Azkaban breaks, and public panic, the Ministry understands that desperate people will reach for desperate magic. Time turners promise the one thing war always steals: do-overs, a murdered child unkilled, a prophecy unheard, a Dark Lord unrisen. Hermione's incident proves that even a controlled academic use can fracture the timeline. In a climate of fear, that same mechanism becomes an existential threat. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated the moment someone asks, "Why grieve when we could rewind?" So, when the Order and the Death Eaters slam into the time room, the unspeakable's calculus is simple. Shelves are not merely in the way, they are acceptable losses. If the battle must happen, better it happen here, where one catastrophic duel can wipe out an entire generation of sanctioned time-turners. The Ministry does not publicly admit this, of course. But internally, the divergence is finalized. Temporal magic is reclassified from dangerous tool to unacceptable weapon. Dumbledore adjusts. Quietly, ruthlessly, after witnessing Hermione's trauma and the time room's instability, he stops entertaining time travel as a strategic option. No secret chronomantic failsafe, no last-second rewind of Godric's Hollow, no temporal assassination of Tom Riddle. Instead, he leans into prophecy, Horcrux lore, and the brutal arithmetic of Harry's sacrificial power. The war's dynamic is fixed to the present tense, which raises the question, if the Ministry burns its own temporal arsenal because of Hermione's mistake, then decades later, when an illegal, more advanced time-turner surfaces in Cursed Child, what is that really? A rogue attempt to win a new war, or a deliberate effort to reach back into that flickering Hogwarts record orb and undo the original fracture she created? Alternate Hermione's, the timeline that refuses to choose. So if someone in the future is reaching back toward that original fracture, what exactly are they reaching for? A weapon, a warning, or a specific girl in a Hogwarts corridor who has already been duplicated once and should not, by any sane reading of magical physics, still exist? To understand the danger, we deconstruct a timeline at its most fragile point when two versions of the same person stand in the same corridor, breathing the same air, holding different memories. The core issue is mechanical. If both Hermiones persist, reality has to make a choice. Either the timeline branches, memory bleeds between them until neither is stable, or magic enforces a brutal conservation law and one is erased, her experiences demoted to an echo. In Department of Mysteries language, this is not romance, it is waste management. Two identical temporal assets cannot occupy one continuous structure without a cost. Do you get an alternate Cursed Child style branch, where one Hermione remembers Buckbeak dying and Sirius executed, while another remembers the clean rescue? Or does the divergence collapse, leaving behind a single survivor whose mind now carries both records, two incompatible histories, welded into one psychological scar? This is where Dumbledore and the Unspeakables step in. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated the moment a 13-year-old accidentally proves paradox is not just theoretical. Behind the scenes, they suddenly have options that are all terrible. They can merge the Hermiones by collapsing the loop, forcing the younger body to catch up to the older memories in a single traumatic download. They can exile one into a sealed temporal pocket, a kind of suspended sentence outside history, or they can attempt to anchor one as primary, marking her with wards so that the other gradually fades. A ghost of decision rather than a person. Now, reframe the series with one quiet assumption. The Hermione we follow from Goblet of Fire onward is the paradox survivor. She is the one who remembers both the original, failed loop, and the corrected version Dumbledore insists must stand. She knows, in sickening detail, what happens when she mistimes a turn, when Snape sees her duplicate, when Fudge notices Sirius's absence, and orders a sweep that ends with Dementors in the wrong place. Pattern interrupt. Go back to Order of the Phoenix. The time-turners are destroyed in the time room, and Hermione's reaction is not scholarly disappointment, it is near panic, an almost physical recoil. Read it not as "there go my extra classes," but as the visceral relief of someone watching the gun she once fired being melted down in front of her. Her fierce opposition to time magic in Cursed Child-era discourse stops being abstract caution and becomes self-indictment. She is the minister who has already watched one ruined timeline unfurl, who has stood in a Hogwarts hospital wing, holding a set of memories no one else shares, and agreed, quietly, to let her other self be unmade, which leaves one final, unnerving question hanging over Deathly Hallows. When you see Hermione in the forest, calm under fire, ruthlessly prepared, packing a beaded bag with the precision of someone gaming out 100 contingencies, Are you watching a brilliant witch improvising on the fly, or a paradox veteran who has already watched Harry die once and is determined that, in this version, the divergence is finalized in his favor? And if she is that survivor, what exactly did she have to sacrifice in the erased timeline to earn the right to stand beside him in this one? Harry, without a godfather, the war's new emotional geometry. So what happens to a boy who never even gets the brief miracle of a godfather's kitchen fire? What does the war look like when the one adult who chose Harry first is removed not in a curtain flutter, but in a courtroom? In this fractured reality, we deconstruct a timeline where Sirius Black is not lost in battle. He is processed. In canon, the emotional geometry is simple, almost merciful in its cruelty. Harry gains Sirius in 3rd year, loses him in 5th, hope blooms, is ripped away, and the audience can trace a clean arc of grief. Here, the core issue is mechanical. Sirius is either kissed or buried alive in Azkaban long before Harry can build that bond. There is no arc, there is an absence, and then a verdict. That verdict matters. Instead of the warm, chaotic godfather who sends him a firebolt and bad advice, Harry receives secondhand reports. The man who would have taken him in is gone because the Ministry feared time more than injustice. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated in a single headline. The boy who lived learns that the adults who might have saved his family twice chose procedural safety over loyalty. This reframes the Order of the Phoenix completely. In the original structure, the Order are Sirius's comrades. Grimmauld Place is both war room and surrogate home, and Harry's trust in them is braided through his love for Sirius. Here, those same faces, Moody, Lupin, even Molly, are the people who failed to extract Sirius when it still counted, then failed again when the time room incident made him politically untouchable. They are not his godfather's allies. They are the committee that let his last remaining parent die on paper. The subtext is brutal. 5th year Harry, already volatile, walks into Umbridge's regime with no private hearth to rage at, no deranged dog Animagus to convert fury into black humor. His anger at Dumbledore's distance is no longer a confused adolescent backlash. It is a coherent indictment. You knew. You let them keep him in that place. Detentions with Umbridge cut deeper. There is no Sirius to mock the absurdity of her rules. No late-night fire call to reframe cruelty as resistance. The psychological pressure builds until Dumbledore's army is not a rebellious club, but an inevitability, a paramilitary reflex from a child who has learned that institutions either lie or abandon. The turning point arrives not in the snow at Hogsmeade, but in the moment Harry realizes the Order will not even publicly name what was done to Sirius. Then the prophecy, the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord, lands differently on a boy who has never experienced sustained adult love. Without Sirius's half-formed mentorship, there is no competing narrative of a future where he lives long enough to be godfather to someone else's child. Fatalism sharpens. Reckless heroism becomes policy. If he is a weapon, he will at least choose where to be aimed. Pattern interrupt. The Department of Mysteries. In canon, the emotional climax is Sirius falling through the veil. Here, Sirius is already gone. The veil is just architecture. The real confrontation is with the time room itself, the shelves of shattered time turners, the echo of the accident that cost him his godfather years earlier. Picture Harry, wand raised, staring at the glass and sand that once represented a second chance, understanding that this room killed Sirius without ever touching him. He is not trying to save a man. He is trying to hurt a concept. Time, prophecy, ministry regulation, the invisible structure that turned his life into a controlled experiment. When he hurls himself into that battle, it is not only to rescue his friends, but to assault the machinery of fate that Hermione accidentally weaponized against him. And when the dust settles, the question that remains is not, why did Sirius die? But if time did this to me once, what will I let it take next? Hermione's trauma, from time turner prodigy to reluctant temporal guardian. Hermione answers that question with work, not speeches, not tears in the courtyard. Work, in the most Hermione Granger sense of the word, a retreat into parchment, ink, and the cold architecture of magical theory. While Harry and Ron limp back toward something resembling normal school life, she vanishes into the library's deepest aisles, chasing a branch of magic that has already proved it can maim reality itself. The core issue is mechanical. She is convinced that somewhere, hidden in the equations of temporal displacement and the Ministry's dry memos on authorized rotations, there must be a way to unfracture what she has done. So she copies arithmetic matrices until dawn, cross-references every recorded use of time turners, and builds color-coded timelines on spare rolls of parchment, mapping each decision point that led to Buckbeak's suffering and Sirius's death. Sleep becomes an optional side quest. Quidditch, Hogsmeade, even idle gossip in the common room fall away. On the surface, this reads as overachieving turned up a notch. The subtext is brutal. Hermione is trying to prove, to herself more than to Dumbledore or the Ministry, that the universe still runs on rules, that if she can just find the right variable, the right turn, she can pay back a debt to Harry that time itself is now charging interest on. Every unanswered question in a textbook is a reminder she once miscalculated with a human life. When the turning point arrives in 4th year and she launches SPEW, the usual reading is moral outrage and academic exposure to injustice. In this fractured timeline, something deeper is humming underneath. She has seen what hidden systems do, the way an invisible schedule of rotations, an unspeakable's quiet experiment, can reach out of a locked ministry office and crush a boy on a hippogriff and a man at a window, house elf servitude, goblin banking clauses, educational decrees. All of it looks to her like smaller time rooms, humming away where no one wants to look. So she attacks structures. She badgers classmates to knit hats, annotates legal codes in the margins of her defense essays, and starts asking questions that make professors uncomfortable. Who signed off on the time room? Why are time turners issued to school children? Who profits when risk is invisible and consequences land on the powerless? We deconstruct a timeline where Hermione's activism is not a side plot, it is trauma management scaled up into policy. After Hogwarts, the divergence is finalized. The canonical Hermione drifts toward the Ministry as an arena for reform. This Hermione walks straight toward the Department of Mysteries, or toward the legislative committees that can starve it of power. In one version, she becomes the unspeakable, who locks the last prototype time turner in a ward only she understands. In another, she is the witch who drafts the Temporal Integrity Act, a law that does in parchment what she could not do in 3rd year, forbid herself from ever trying again. Cursed Child gives us a future, where advanced time turners re-enter the game, regulated, hunted, feared. In this reality, who better to lead that hunt than the girl who once broke time by following the rules? Minister Hermione Granger, architect of paradox patrols and temporal audits, is not just protecting the world from reckless inventors, she is protecting her younger self from the question that ruined her. But what happens when that question comes back with teeth? Imagine a recovered experimental time turner on her desk, reports of a narrow window in which Sirius might be saved, and an entire wizarding world begging its minister to fix a historical wound. Does she risk everything? Her laws, her legitimacy, the fragile stability of a scarred timeline, to reach through the glass one more time? Or does she refuse, knowing that the first miracle she attempted with time magic ended not in salvation, but in a debt that can never truly be repaid? The Ministry's nightmare, temporal quarantine around Hogwarts. So what does a government do when a schoolgirl proves that time can bleed? The answer is not noble, it is administrative. In the months after Hermione's miscalculation, the Ministry does not publicly confess that reality almost sheared open around a 3rd year dormitory. It drafts forms. It amends regulations. Entire subclauses are born in the shadow of one night in June. The core issue is mechanical. Time turners, once a niche academic convenience, become instruments of existential risk. Licensing is rebuilt from the ground up. No more quiet favors for promising students. No more special arrangements signed off by a sympathetic headmaster. Every device is bound to a named bearer, a blood sample, and a binding oath. Every rotation is logged in the time room, cross-checked against enchanted clocks that now sit, unseen, in the rafters of Hogwarts. Mandatory reporting arrives next. Any suspected temporal anomaly, duplicated sightings, overlapping alibis, a corridor where 2 voices echo in perfect sync must be reported within 24 hours to a new unit in the Department of Mysteries. Failure is not a slap on the wrist, it is a criminal act. The subtext is brutal. The state has decided that ignorance about time is no longer innocent. Around Hogwarts, the quarantine is elegant precisely because it is invisible. Wards are woven into the existing defensive lattice of the castle, keyed not to dark magic, but to doubled magical signatures. A student cannot occupy the same 10 square feet twice, without the stone itself whispering to the time room. Hallway hourglasses synchronize with ministry chronometers. Once a year, an unspeakable arrives under the neutral banner of a safety audit, ostensibly checking staircases and cauldrons, while quietly testing for temporal residue in the walls. Students feel the pressure without seeing the chains. Rumors spread of time ghosts in the 5th floor corridor, translucent afterimages of people who almost died in a loop that technically never happened. First years are warned, half superstition, half policy, not to experiment with certain time-adjacent charms near windows, not because the spells are advanced, but because the castle remembers. When time nearly fractured, we deconstruct a timeline, and the building itself becomes evidence. This paranoia has a cost. While the ministry obsesses over paradoxes, it underestimates more conventional threats. Auror hours are diverted to auditing timetables instead of tracking Death Eater safe houses. Intelligence about masked figures near Nocturne Alley is downgraded because, on parchment, it resembles yet another temporal misreport. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated, but the replacement structure is misaligned. The apparatus of power is pointed at the wrong catastrophe. The turning point arrives when Voldemort learns to move in those blind spots, staging attacks in moments the Ministry has already flagged as temporally contaminated and therefore unreliable. In a war built on fear and information, this financial technicality forces the good side to doubt its own clocks. And somewhere in Hogwarts, in a disused classroom, or behind a tapestry, something else remains. A looped whisper that never quite fades. A double footprint in dust that never fully settles. If anyone ever finds the precise square of stone where Hermione's error first echoed, the divergence is finalized, because touching that echo would not just recall a memory, it would give someone the coordinates of a wound in time and a reason to open it. 3 timelines, 1 choice. Which Hermione's world do you save? So, what happens if someone does open that wound? What happens when we deconstruct a timeline that was already held together with academic caution and Dumbledore's optimism? At this point, we have to admit there isn't just one Hogwarts. There are 3. First, the world you recognize, original Hermione. In this structure, the loop holds. Buckbeak lives, Sirius escapes, the executioner's axe hits a pumpkin rather than a neck. Time turners remain in their ministry cabinets until the Department of Mysteries shatters them during the Order of the Phoenix battle, and Hermione walks away with an outstanding in every subject and a theoretical understanding that magic can bend reality but must not break it. She has nightmares about Dementors, not about duplicate selves screaming in corridors. The subtext is brutal precisely because it is so clean. She was always meant to succeed. Then, the paradox Hermione we've traced. Here, the turning point arrives a few minutes off. Buckbeak dies on schedule, Sirius is kissed or recaptured, and Hermione's miscalculation exposes the fracture to every adult who matters. The Ministry intervenes, not as a distant bureaucracy, but as a crisis unit. Time rooms are sealed, experimental devices removed, unspeakables conducting psychological interviews with a 14-year-old who has technically committed a crime against causality. She grows up knowing she did not just witness injustice, she authored a broken loop and watched people she loved fall through it. In that timeline, loyalty becomes heavier. Every friendship is shadowed by the knowledge that, somewhere, there was a version where they were saved. Her power over hours and minutes has been revoked, but the responsibility lingers. She studies law, or time theory, or both, not out of curiosity, but penance. Now introduce a third, colder configuration, the Ministry fixed timeline. Here, their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated. Unspeakables do not merely confiscate the time turner, they rewrite the debris. Memories are edited, days compressed, perhaps entire conversations surgically removed so that the paradox never stabilizes enough to propagate. Buckbeak may still die, Sirius may still be lost. But the core issue is mechanical. The Ministry decides that individual lives are expendable. The integrity of history is not. Imagine Hermione in this version. She wakes with a gap where an evening should be, a faint nausea when she passes the time room, an unaccountable distrust of clocks, Officially, nothing happened. Unofficially, her mind has been used as a storage device and then reformatted. So, which world do you save? The canon loop that preserves a handful of beloved figures at the cost of a fragile, self-correcting timeline. The paradox line, where a teenager carries the open wound of having broken reality, but at least remembers why. Or the ministry fixed configuration, where the divergence is finalized in a locked file, and the public is protected by enforced ignorance rather than truth. Pattern interrupt. You are not a viewer now. You are Hermione at 14. The time turner is warm in your hand. You know that turning it might rescue Buckbeak and Sirius, or it might fracture the entire war to come. Do you twist the chain and step into the forbidden corridor of time, or do you let them die to keep the structure of history intact? And more disturbingly, should you ever have been allowed to choose? Closing the loop. Why Hermione's one mistake changes everything. You shouldn't have been allowed to choose, but she did. She chose, she misturned, and in this episode, we deconstruct a timeline where that single, trembling decision does not quietly fold back into canon, it detonates. Look at the divergences now that the dust has settled. One extra twist on the chain, one miscounted hour, and the core issue is mechanical. The wrong Hermione steps into the wrong corridor at the wrong second. Overlapping Hermione's lock eyes outside Hagrid's hut. The subtext is brutal. Buckbeak still dies on the lawn. The executioner's axe actually falls, and that sound becomes a fixed point echoing through every altered year that follows. Sirius does not glide away on the back of a living hippogriff. He is cornered, recaptured, or killed, depending on which branch of the paradox you find most persuasive, but in every version, Harry loses the godfather he was promised. The divergence is finalized when unspeakables arrive in the forest, wands already tuned to temporal fractures. They do not see children who broke a school rule. They see a catastrophic breach in the Ministry's illusion of control. From there, reality hardens around fear. The time room is no longer a quiet archive of regulated magic. It becomes a bunker. Paradox patrols sweep Hogwarts, time turners are seized, and when the Ministry is later destroyed in that experimental time magic accident we traced earlier, it is not a random tragedy. It is the bureaucratic aftershock of Hermione's one mistake, the institutionalization of her private guilt, and at the center of all this structure is still a 14-year-old girl who only wanted to save a friend and attend more classes. Hermione begins as the rule follower, the person who treats timetables as sacred texts. In the original timeline, she breaks one rule and the universe quietly forgives her. Here, that same fracture in her loyalty to authority reshapes Harry's war, Ron's losses, and the wizarding world's relationship with time itself. Her trauma stops being invisible, it becomes public policy. This is the thematic knife twist. In Harry Potter, love and choice define destiny. Lily's protection, Snape's vow, Harry's walk into the forest. The magic is moral before it is mechanical, but once you add time travel, even a small choice, a miscounted turn, a conversation overheard by the wrong Hermione can echo across decades. A moment of teenage panic is upgraded into a historical event, a psychological scar that entire generations are forced to live inside. So, if you had to inhabit one of these timelines, which would you choose? The original Hermione loop, where the rules bend but never break. The paradox Hermione reality, where overlapping selves and dead hippogriffs haunt every victory. Or the Ministry fixed world, where unspeakables rip the time turners away and sacrifice temporal freedom for safety. Tell me, in the comments, which timeline you'd stake your future on and why. We'll feature the most compelling arguments and the most ruthless logical takedowns in a future episode, and then push the thought experiment further. If this is what happens when Hermione slips, what happens when someone darker gets the chain? Do we deconstruct a timeline where Snape receives the time turner instead, weaponizing regret, or one where Voldemort steals a prototype and turns the entire war into a looping siege? Drop your wildest time turner what if in the comments. The next episode will dive into one of your timelines and close a very different loop.